Montreal, 1976. African countries boycott Olympics. Sports have long been a unifying power, surpassing borders and cultures. Countries utilize it to engage each other, making it a diplomatic tool. International sports can be used to strengthen diplomatic messages, articulate political agendas, or create pressure. One such multifaceted relationship between sports and politics was highlighted in the Montreal 1976 Olympic Games when several African countries boycotted it. Since the mid-1950s, several international campaigns were at play to isolate South Africa from global politics due to its apartheid policies. The athletes from different races could not compete together, and only the white South African players were sent to play in meaningful events. Despite increasing international pressure, the South African NOC showed reluctance to include non-white athletes and did not pay any heed to following the IOC's principles. Therefore, the IOC expelled South Africa from the Olympic movement. In the context of these events, hopes were all lost when the rugby team of New Zealand decided to tour South Africa in 1976. The tour was clearly seen as a support to the apartheid regime. As soon as this tour was announced, several African, Caribbean, and Eastern European countries decided to boycott the Olympic Games, or the games where New Zealand was playing. Back then, rugby wasn't even an Olympic sport, but the message sent by the boycott was clear. Most highlighted were the 28 African states that just announced a couple of days before the opening ceremony that they would boycott the Olympic Games being held in Montreal. The African countries boycotting the Montreal Olympic Games not only wanted to prevent South Africa from the Games, but also did not want any state or organization to legitimize the racist and apartheid regime of South Africa. Many of boycotting African countries were former colonies of European powers that have experienced colonial oppression. In order to understand what happened in Montreal, you need to know the basics of postcolonialism. The postcolonial theory criticizes social histories, cultural differences, and political discrimination being normalized by the colonial and imperial machinery. Postcolonialism resists the colonial legacies and aims to highlight the marginalized voices. It relies on a shared struggle and solidarity among the formerly colonized and oppressed groups against the colonizing powers. Since the African nations had experienced colonial violence, from a post-colonial perspective, it was important to take notice of apartheid policies of South Africa. In June 1976, anti-apartheid protesters were massacred during the Soweto protest. Thus, boycott by African states showed ongoing struggle to reject the discriminating policies and gain self-determination. The post-colonialism theory would recognize the boycott of Montreal's 1976 Olympic Games by African states as an act of resistance against South African apartheid policies. The boycott showed that the African states resisted even those that affirmed the apartheid state, like New Zealand. The coming together of African states for this boycott reflects solidarity among the previously colonized states. The African states united to reaffirm their stance against the apartheid and racist policies in South Africa. The Olympic boycott by the African states shows how collective action can be used to give a meaning to the belief that sports must be free, fair, and accessible to all. African states had suffered from the subjugation of colonial powers. They needed time to build strong resistance and resilience against modern colonial and imperial powers. As studied through a post-colonial perspective, the African countries' boycott of the 1976 Montreal Olympics allows us to highlight how the boycott was not merely of the Olympic Games, but against the colonial powers and oppression in action. The Montreal Olympics was a key moment. People began talking about the issue and pressured their own governments. discrimination ended almost 20 years later in South Africa.